The Civil War was one of the most pinnacle events in shaping the United States into what it is today. We as a society regularly talk about the tactics, strategies, battles, and generals. We now even talk about the statues and the way we remember the Civil War. However, one thing we really do not talk about is the extent of the damage and tragedy that took place during the Civil War. Between 600 and 800,000 soldiers died, which was roughly 2 to 3% of the population. Today, that number would be between 6 and 12 million people. 2 out of those 3 came from disease. 68,162 inquiries were answered by the Missing Soldiers Office from 1865 to 1868. 1 in 5 soldiers were killed during the war, with a 3-to-1 ratio of Confederate to Union deaths. There were 4 million slaves in 1860. Over 100,000 Union corpses were found through a federal reinternment program from 1866 to 1869. 58 dead Confederates were thrown down a farmer's well in 1862. When Union soldiers tried to cross the Rappahannock River, Confederate soldiers fired at the Union engineers. This led Burnside to send a warning to the mayor of Fredericksburg, warning the civilians to leave the city as it was going to be bombarded by Union artillery. Upon the Union retreat, Confederates were left with a massive ruin that led to views that the Union soldiers were barbaric while the Confederates were heroes defending the innocent. While Petersburg was under siege and being destroyed slowly over a couple months, Robert E. Lee sent Juba Early to the Shenandoah Valley. Upon seeing the destruction, Early sent John McCausland to Chambersburg to demand $100,000 in gold. Chambersburg refused, and McCausland then burned the town. 500 out of 800 buildings in Chambersburg were destroyed, including 278 residences and places of business, 98 barns and stables, and 173 outstanding outbuildings of various kinds. This kind of destruction took place all over, from Atlanta, Georgia, to Vicksburg, Mississippi, to Charleston, South Carolina, to Petersburg, Virginia, to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For this narrative slide, show uses Maryland Standards 5.0. History students shall inquire about significant events, ideas, beliefs, and themes to identify patterns and trends, and to analyze how individuals and societies have changed over time, to make connections to the present and their continuity, Maryland, the United States, and the world, and Standard 6.0, Skills and Processes. Students shall inquire about civics, geography, economics, history, and people and nations of the world, using disciplinary literacy skills and processes to critically evaluate content through a variety of source materials across disciplines, and use reading, writing, and other forms of communication to develop, defend, and critique arguments in order to take informed action. This assignment will teach students about history of the Civil War, and they will also gain some skills as a historian. Specifically, the topic of the Civil War, they will be describing economic opportunities and obstacles faced by soldiers, civilians, free and enslaved populations during the Civil War. This assignment specifically shows obstacles faced by various populations of the United States. Didactically, the students will be able to identify the negative effects of the Civil War in terms of casualties and destruction. The pedagogical practices will be to make a narrative slideshow where the students will find historic pictures from the Library of Congress and narrate what the picture is and how it relates to the Civil War. The expectation is the students will search and pick out 5 relevant historical artifacts and use those pictures to show historical facts related to the Civil War. Reflectively, the students will be able to use historic images to argue a specific point about the negative effects of the war. The pedagogical practice will be to make a narrative slideshow where the students will find historic pictures from the Library of Congress and narrate what happened and how it relates to the Civil War. The expectation is that students will search out and pick out 5 relevant historical artifacts and use those pictures to argue a specific point about the negative side effects of the war. Effectively, the students will use historical images to argue whether the Civil War was fought morally based on casualty data and other primary sources. The pedagogical practice will be to make a narrative slideshow where the students will find historical pictures from the Library of Congress and narrate what the picture is and how it relates to the Civil War. The expectation is that the students will search and pick out 5 relevant historical artifacts and use those pictures to show whether the Civil War was fought morally by including pictures and other historical documents. Thus, with this assignment, students will be identifying some of the more tragic parts of the Civil War while also getting good historical skills of research while also having fun and making a mini narrated slideshow.